maybe it's just me, but the best part of Destiny is when you finally finish whatever mechanic or puzzle the game threw at you, and now you get to start damaging the boss. Perfectly balancing reloads, getting your crits just right, and arcing your grenades at the right angle, ain't nothing better. So today, I want to take a trip. With special thanks to Aoterra, Panora, Evan F1997, and Vote for Shifu, let's go back through the years and see how the Destiny 2 DPS meta has evolved. As always, we gotta have some guidelines. I'm primarily gonna focus on metas that were used for day one raids or which were used by speedrunners. Yes, technically any gun can be used for DPS, but this video is going to highlight what was used by top runners to speed through their respective encounters with the highest efficiency. And lastly, I'm going to try to mention abilities as little as possible, since this video is aimed at weapon meta. But if an ability played a key role in some way, I will mention it. Unless specifically said, just imagine that everyone is either a speedy warlock, a golden gun hunter, or a bubble titan. Understood? Great. Let's get started. All the way back to September of 2017, when Destiny 2 released, it was the Wild West. Snipers, shotguns, and fusions were in the heavy slot, linears were considered trash, and there were no flags to get heavy ammo. Yeah, it was a fun time. I think it's safe to say speedrunners set the first true DPS meta. Cold Heart and Cluster Bomb rocket launchers, specifically the Sins of the Past or Warcliff rocket launcher with an auto-reloading Titan Rally barricade. This would be the case for about 6 months. With the 2018 March update, snipers, linears, and shotguns got a PvE buff, but it still wasn't enough to take rockets out of the spotlight. The only other noteworthy update was in May. The Warlock Lunafaction boots were made so you didn't have to strafe in and out of them to get the auto reload perk. You could just stand there. But as for weapons, it wouldn't be until Warmind when the DPS meta would take a massive shift in power. The Warmind expansion was definitely the most welcome part of Destiny 2's first year. Escalation Protocol was amazing, the raid was the hardest we'd seen up to this point, and some new weapons would shake the meta for the first time since release. Now don't get me wrong, rockets were still incredibly strong, but 3 distinct weapons would make an appearance. Sleeper Simulant, the Aikilo shotgun, and the legendary Whisper of the Worm. Now 2 of these guns are a little different. While Sleeper was good, and rockets had their place here or there, they couldn't hold a candle to the 2 monsters that were the Aikilo Shotty and the Whisper Sniper Rifle. Why were they so strong? Well... Yeah, this was kinda dumb. The power these 2 weapons brought would shake Destiny 2 forever. Every short-range encounter would be beaten by the Aikilos, and nearly every long-range encounter was dominated by Whisper. However, one of the most hated things about Year 1 was about to be erased. All the new lights nowadays probably don't know this, but shotguns, snipers, and rockets all shared the same weapon slot. After Warmind, this game would go through its biggest change it would ever go through. Forsaken. With the release of Destiny 2's biggest expansion, a couple things changed. For one, shotguns and some snipers were now in non-heavy slots, so shotguns and rockets, or shotguns and the Whisper, was now possible. And second, Well of Radiance made most encounters a cakewalk. In fact, let's discuss how buffs and debuffs stacked for a second. Nowadays, you can only have 1 buff on a target at a time, i.e. either a Titan Bubble or a Well of Radiance. But back then, every buff was stackable. Getting damage numbers that was 3x the original hit was not uncommon. Yes, you kinda had to know what you were doing, but it was not difficult. Alongside that, Tractor Cannon got a very noteworthy rework. It used to debuff enemies to allow 33% more damage, but now all void damage got buffed by 50%. But anyway, back to the weapons. The only noteworthy meta outside of this in Forsaken was if your PC was playing at a higher frame rate, 1000 voices did more damage. This would be a thing for a while and would be used occasionally in certain runs, but was never truly meta. From the time of Forsaken's release to about December of 2018, the Aikilo Shoddy, Whisper Sniper, and Cluster Rockets was the true meta. While it only lasted for about 3 months, this was one of those eras that people always look back and smile upon. December of 2018 brings about the end of Forsaken and introduces Black Armory. Now we all thought this was going to be a fairly decent year, but we had no idea that year 2 was going to introduce some of the weirdest metas Destiny had or would ever see. And while yes, the Aikilo Shotgun, Whisper, and nichely Cluster Rockets would make up a majority of the damage meta, right out of the gate we got an odd contender for top dog, Darcy. Granted, I'm being a little dramatic. Whisper was still better in most situations, but if you ever had an encounter where you needed hard burst DPS, Darcy was king. And while this was fun and all, Black Army would birth 3 of the most broken guns to date: Izanagi's Burden, Mountaintop, and Anarchy. First, Izanagi. This gun has a unique perk where you can cram your whole magazine into a single bullet, doing insane damage. I seriously don't know what Bungie was thinking when they made this gun. Bosses became a joke. And while it wouldn't take the direct spotlight until about Shadowkeep, Izanagi would be a dominant method of melting bosses for years to come. And Mountaintop, on the other hand, this gun would go to break boss encounters like no other special weapon would. With an auto-loading well, Mountaintop kinda messed up bosses. And then there was Anarchy. Anarchy would go to be the default heavy weapon for years. Seriously, there was rarely ever a time this thing left your heavy slot. Outside of new guns though, Black Armory buffed a gun that hadn't been relevant in 6 years, Thunderlord. While it was never the best gun to use in most situations, as you can see, Thunderlord had a reputation for melting bosses. But anyway, let's continue. Yes, it had its issues, but Black Armor would be one of the community's most beloved seasons to this day. Black Army was wacky, that's for sure, but Joker's Wild would be the last season of unadulterated lunacy. Due to it being the quote-unquote Gambit season, people forget that literally anything and everything was melting bosses. The infinite ammo of Whisper, Thunderlord incinerating strike bosses, Anarchy doing Anarchy things, Mountaintop putting Callus to shame, Izanagi making raids a meme, and filling Riven's mouth with cluster rockets, everything was a good idea. Note that I missed something. One gun would get a massive nerf, the Aikilo shotgun. This gun, and the Scourge of the Past threat level, had a perk called Trench Barrel. Punching a target would give you more damage, and you'd have more than enough time to unload your entire magazine, subsequently reducing every boss to dust. Now, Trench Barrel would only be active for 3 shots. Frankly, this nerf was unfair, and widely hated by the community. With one patch, these shotguns went from being a required loadout to wasting vault space. But speaking of punching, Joker's Wild would introduce a punch-based exotic that would bring a new age of death by battery. Check this clip of pre-nerf Liar's Handshake. And yes, these would be nerfed in the future, but ironically are still a decent option even to this day. Rolling back to weapons though, Joker's Wild would introduce a weapon that would once again, of course, shake the meta. Now Bungie always receives flack when they reintroduce weapons from Destiny 1. However, with Outbreak perfected, not one bad word was said. One of the greatest secret missions was made, and Outbreak would be one of the most disgusting primaries ever made. I mean, if you had 6 people running it, it was on par with even the most broken of heavy weapons. While Joker's Wild was not the best of seasons, it was the last season of unregulated madness. Starting the next season, some changes would be made. Not all bad, but a new era of DPS was starting to rise. The season of Opulence is without question one of the community's favorite seasons. Between the Crown of Sorrows raid, the Menagerie public event, and the returning D1 weapons, Opulence was a crowd pleaser in a way most seasons only dream of. However, Bungie started the season off with 2 nerfs that would ruin some of the most beloved guns in the community. Whisper the Worm was getting nerfed. Now, you would no longer have infinite ammo. You would only have the bullets carried by the gun in the reserves and the magazine, which honestly was not a lot. This would be arguably one of the biggest nerfs in Destiny 2's history, and while the second nerf wasn't as controversial, it still wasn't a fun one. Outbreak Perfected does more damage the more shots you put on a target. However, shots would stack on a target even if the target was immune. This allowed you to prep targets for maximum meltage. After the patch, you couldn't stack shots on immune targets. And while this nerf was a reasonable balance, it was enough to take it out of the spotlight. The two guns that ended up taking the spotlight was Mountaintop, and completely out of left field, the Swarm of the Raven grenade launcher. Remember how Tractor Cannon buffed void damage more than Solar or Arc, 50% instead of 33? Well, some smart people figured out if you get a Swarm grenade launcher with spike grenades, you could melt bosses. Most DPS phases were composed of this style, what I call the unloading meta, where you stand in a well and unload your whole magazine and all your reserves. Whether it was snipers, rockets, or grenade launchers, most bosses were not very difficult. Was this fair? That's for you to decide. But what everyone was in agreement with, it was a fun time to be a Destiny player. And then the yearly update came. In October of 2019, the yearly expansion Shadowkeep was released. Shadowkeep was one of the most influential expansions in Destiny history, and not in the best way. Shadowkeep saw the introduction of the seasonal content model. 1 yearly expansion plus 4 seasons. Aside from 1 or 2, very few seasons benefited from this model and would go largely disliked by the community. But the biggest issue was Shadowkeep brought a lot of nerfs and balances to the meta. And I mean a lot. The biggest one by far was that auto-reloading in a Warlock well or a Titan barricade was now changed to simply faster reloading. Infinitely spamming your rockets was now dead. The second biggest thing that got nerfed was that you could no longer stack buffs on your team. Now you could only have 1 buff at a time as opposed to bubble plus well plus radiance, etc. The community had a very difficult time transitioning to this new meta. Auto-reloading had been a staple for nearly a year and a half. However, the new meta was faster than ever. Speedrunners were going to break this game like never before. Back in Opulence, a grenade launcher was introduced. Y'all thought I forgot about Wendigo, didn't you? It wasn't as good as Swarm when it released, but it had a perk where if it picked up a lot of orbs of light, it did a lot more damage, called Explosive Light. People found it was probably the best complement to Shadowkeep's new DPS king, Izanagi. If you did a tech called reload canceling, you could pump out insane damage. So if you did this while shooting Wendigo wherever you could fit it in, yeah, bosses were kind of a joke. Not a DPS gun, but one of the only true support guns ever in Destiny, Divinity, was introduced. This gun produced a giant bubble that not only gave everyone a very easy to hit critical, but also debuffed the target. Having a Divinity on your team would be an essential element for nearly every boss, ironically being one of the most meta-changing guns in Destiny history for years to come. After Shadowkeep, a rare occurrence happened. The meta didn't change for a long time. From October 2019 all the way to March of 2020, the meta remained largely unchanged. The only notable exception was in Season of Dawn. We would get a glimpse of what was to come. The Line in the Sand was the first legendary linear fusion rifle that put out respectable numbers. Now, it wouldn't be meta at the current moment, but it was the first linear to show what would be meta in a couple years. During these 5 months, Izanagi would reign supreme, destroying every enemy in its wake. But as expected, a nerf would come that would both ruin the old meta and introduce a better one. In Season of the Worthy, Izanagi's nerf was that you couldn't properly reload cancel anymore. Now, the reload timer wouldn't reset, whether the animation was done or not. While the Izanagi would never see strength like this ever again, the damage wouldn't slow down. Remember that Wendigo grenade launcher? Well, there were a few others like it now. Swarm of the Raven was still a solid contender, but it lacked extra damage perks. Interference, for example, could roll with spike grenades, auto-loading holster, and full court, which basically just does more damage. Alongside Wendigo, the era of Izanagi and auto-loading grenade launchers was born, or more affectionately known as the Izzy Wendy. With Season of Arrivals came not only the longest season in Destiny 2, but a few things happened to the meta. One, the Falling Guillotine Sword was introduced. If you got a god roll, this sword did stupid damage. Obviously this would get patched relatively quickly, but the other two things that happened? Witherhoard was introduced. While this wasn't a primary DPS option, it was a fantastic secondary, allowing you to stick a target and then pummel them with damage from your heavy or special. However, it was bugged for about a week. Play the clip.
Wait for it.
But arguably the most broken change was to slug shotguns. Slugs got a 30% damage buff. The Blasphemer and the First In, Last Out, or Philo, were the first to show the power of quick swapping shotguns. Keep an eye out on this one. As with every yearly expansion, there were nerfs and buffs. The Falling Guillotine especially got a 24% direct nerf to its damage, but it would still be the best legendary sword to use even to this day. Yeah, it was that powerful. And Mountaintop would get a massive nerf. It would receive a 20% nerf to its bullet velocity, a 33% nerf to its damage, and it would lose its perfect inner accuracy. While still good, it was no longer a top tier option. At least that's all I would have probably said if it wasn't for one massive thing. Sunsetting. If you don't know what this means, it means that after a specified amount of time, a gun would become unable to be leveled up, so it couldn't be used in the current season. In this case, it gave every weapon and armor piece a 3-season lifespan. I'm not going to go too deep into this atrocity, but the important thing to remember is that essentially every legendary weapon from year 1 and 2 was sunset with this season. Most prominently, Mountaintop and Wendigo. Now all was not lost. Mountaintop would be mostly replaced by snipers, and Wendigo would be replaced by interference. But in the chaos that was sunsetting, a gun combo was reintroduced that took the game to new heights. One of the best metas to date. Now would come, and only the second time ever, a lull in meta changes. The meta would be 1 Divinity and 5 double slugs with Anarchies, or 1 Divinity and 5 Izanagis with interference, with a little sniper sprinkled in there. Aside from Lament essentially replacing Falling Guillotine, and Titans getting the big smacky chest, the meta would remain largely unchanged for nearly a year, until August of 2021. In August, 2 big nerfs would arise. Anarchy, the king of damage over time, was tremendously nerfed. Some say it was a bit strong, but after 2.5 years of dominating the heavy slot, Anarchy's run was long and infamous. The second nerf was to slug swapping. One of the primary DPS methods for nearly a year was getting pushed down. Granted, the main reason it was insane was due to a glitch, so the nerf was relatively reasonable. The community was not happy though, and in my opinion, rightfully so. But before the end of the year, we'd get a rare reintroduction of a Destiny 1 meta. In December of 2021, the legendary Gallowhorn would make a reappearance. Now with this variant, it had a perk that gave other legendary rockets, which conveniently got a massive buff a couple seasons prior, Wolfpack rounds, essentially super mini rockets alongside its main rocket. This meta would endure to even this day. As of the making of this video, we have one last yearly expansion to cover, and one last big meta change to talk about. In February of 2022, we'd get the Witch Queen expansion. Aside from 1 Gallowhorn and 5 legendary rockets, the Izanagi rocket shot was still good, and double slugs were still good. But after the Valve the Disciple raid, folks noticed that linear fusion rifles were doing a lot of damage. Linears kind of flew under the radar, but they received a sizable buff a couple seasons back. With this, almost every heavy weapon had a place in the meta. Rockets, linear fusion rifles, and snipers are riding high on this game even to this day. And that's about it. As of the making of this video, the meta hasn't changed much since Witch Queen, to be honest. Linears, rockets buffed by a Gallahorn, sometimes double slugs, and Izanagi with an auto-loading rocket are four of the most common metas today. Destiny has gone through dozens of ups and downs, guns going in and out of the meta time after time, and they'll continue to go up and down for many more seasons to come. Hope you enjoyed this deep dive through the history of every DPS meta in Destiny history. If you don't want Bungie to nerf any more guns, hit that subscribe button. Alright Guardians, see you next time.